So I'm bringing to you today just some preliminary findings of what I've learned. I'm also putting together a video that brings together and distills the key lessons, which I'll be able to share with the community in a couple of months when it's fully put together. So I'm really excited about that as well. So let's have a look at the people that I met as part of this research. So I got to go out and cover 4 key and very different industries. And that was kind of one of the main objectives for me too, was to be able to experience it from different angles and different perspectives, not just from one particular industry. So we have Steve Crabtree from Learning Live, and they cover a few different areas of industry, but particularly this one I looked at was traffic controllers, so people with the stop slow signs at a roadwork site and similar. Then I got to interview Jackie Bowden from NV College, and Jackie works in individual support. But in this case, we went and did an observation of Jackie in action, assessing someone in an aged care centre. And then I got to meet Lynn from ETC. And that was in the hospitality industry. So we looked at commercial cookery. And I also got to interview an assessor at Brush Farm Corrective Services Academy. So all of the providers there are private RTOs. Brush Farm is a New South Wales government provider, not TAFE though. And I think just because of the nature of that particular provider, we just decided to keep everything anonymous there. And it was a pretty interesting bit of information that I got from that assessor as well. So these are the 4 key areas that I covered. So you can see there's a lot of diversity here, which is fantastic. And what I'll do in today's session is just we'll go in and we'll look at each one specifically and what I learned from each of those individuals. And then we'll kind of bring it together and look at some of the common and key themes, because there were some very common themes that emerged from all 4 assessors across these diverse industries, which was very, very interesting. So this is Steve. I really enjoyed my time with Steve on a rainy day. I went down to Port Macquarie. So Learning Live are an RTO, but they're also an employer. So they also have a traffic control business as well. So I think as part of the training, they're also looking at recruiting many of the successful candidates. So they really take it very, very seriously. And Steve is highly experienced in traffic control and in assessing. And he tells me that he was actually involved in this well before it became part of the VET system. And it was more of a thing that was done by, I guess at the time, the Roads and Traffic Authority in New South Wales. So he's really a wealth of experience. I really loved learning from Steve and watching him in action. So the way that they do theirs is I'd say most of the learning is really done on the job, but they certainly include a classroom component as well. But the part that I observed was an on-the-job, a real workplace assessment. And they go out to a real work site. You know, all the candidates from the course, they go out to different work sites and control traffic under supervision, and they're assessed on their performance. So that was a really great experience. So some key takeaways from Steve is I mentioned this in a session that we ran recently, but I really loved how Steve invested a great deal of time in briefings and instructions to candidates. So I sat in on some of the briefings, and often I think about this from my own perspective in the Cert 4 and what lessons that we teach our students in that. We always talk about the importance of instructions to candidates. But sometimes it's easy to sort of leave that as like a really quick briefing. This is what we're going to do. Any questions? Okay, let's get out there and do our assessments. Steve definitely doesn't do that. The briefing and the instructions, I think, went for a good 40 minutes to an hour. And he really doubled down on all these things. And I think in this case, you know, road traffic control is something that is highly, has a high risk factor. So we really can't get things wrong in that setting when you've got live traffic, real things happening, real people, real lives. So he takes that instructional, that session of giving instructions on how the assessment will take place. He takes it very, very seriously. And as I sat in these briefings with the candidates, I really started to think about how this might apply in other settings. And I really struggled to see a situation where it wouldn't be a good idea to really invest that time for any workplace assessor to spend that time with the candidates, really going over all the instructions, what's going to happen, you know, really checking in, making sure, and almost kind of like mentally playing through the steps in the assessment of what will happen at each step, and checking in about each of those. Do you understand what will happen here? Do you have any questions? And there were questions, and there was discussion around it. But the beautiful thing that happened is when I saw those candidates, you know, leave each of the briefing sessions, they were so confident. You know, you could see as they walked up to the roadside, you know, you could see the spring in their step. They were really keen to get into it. And I feel that was a lot of that was due to, or probably due to great training and you know, having learnt the skills in the first place, but also they had that confidence that was instilled in them from Steve's really good instructions there. And I think also as part of that, he sets really clear expectations. He makes it really clear. He says, okay, guys, you know, this is an assessment. You know, from here on in, when we put the high vis on and we go out there, you know, I'm not going to be the trainer anymore. I'm not a trainer. I can't help you. I'm an assessor, and you're working, and I'll be observing. And he sets those parameters and makes them really, really clear. And I've already mentioned the safety aspect of this. So, but I think that's a really key takeaway from any industry where you've got candidates working on the job. Now, remember that someone who, I mean, they're being assessed, right? So we hope that they've been well trained and they've got a good measure of skill and experience to be able to perform the job to, you know, a decent level and to perform safely and everything else. But they don't have the competency yet. They haven't been officially signed off. That's the whole point of the assessment, is to determine their competence. So there still needs to be a measure of safety and you know, Steve, I asked Steve about this, and he said, you know, if something happens, if something happens that poses a risk to candidate, the public, the assessor, or anyone else, fellow workers, you know, the assessment gets stopped. Yeah, so we don't muck around with that sort of thing. Another interesting feature of this one is, and maybe not so much in some of the others, but Steve and his colleagues will, if necessary, will introduce certain challenges into the workplace assessment. So in a way, it kind of makes it a little bit like a hybrid role play, or sort of brings elements of role play into it. What do I mean by that? It was kind of fun, well, interesting to watch. And it wasn't entirely clear whether this was staged or what it was, but you know, we got a real live traffic site with real public, you know, stop and slow, and the traffic lights and everything going, real cars, and they've got to be assessed on their ability to manage contingencies, and that's a really important part of any kind of competency-based assessment. And so I'm guessing they staged what they call a runner, and so they had a car drive through the stop sign and drive through the red lights. They had traffic lights at one end and they had the lollipop at the other end. So they had a vehicle drive through, do a runner, and they had to observe how the candidate would you know, respond to that situation in accordance with the procedures. So introducing those kind of challenges under a controlled environment is really important. And as part of the assessment too, I didn't observe too many of these ones, but basically they'll send them out to do a work placement as well, so that they can work under the supervision of different team leaders to get this consistency of performance and get a report from the different team leaders. The next assessor that I met was Jackie Bowden from NV College. So similar to Learning Live, the RTO is a separate organisation, but it's owned by the same group of companies, and so they own a series of care facilities, so aged care facilities, and so often the employer is employing the people that are being assessed, and I really liked that setting because it meant that the training was very tightly integrated with the type of job that they'll be doing, which was good. So these students were on traineeships in individual support. And on this day, I got to meet the lovely Leslie, who was being assessed and in that aged care facility. And it was very much set up in that real environment. So it was a real work placement, I got that real exposure to what it's like to be in industry for the candidate, and how the assessor is able to, how Jackie was able to, be a fly on the wall, but gather the evidence that she needed to gather to make her assessment decisions and to provide her feedback. So some key takeaways from Jackie were, number one, Jackie really emphasised the importance of being present. And sometime we had a discussion, and Jackie was really generous in being able to sit down for a filmed interview. So you'll get to see Jackie in that video when we release it, talking about this. But, when it's a real work environment, there's a lot of things going on. There's in this situation, there were real residents who were, being cared for by the people being assessed. So there's a lot going on. And I think for the untrained eye or for the inexperienced assessor, there's a lot that can be missed. And so Jackie really emphasises the importance of being present, of listening, and of observing. And she talks about how sometimes when we have the observation checklist, especially for some of the really complex observations in this industry, it can be quite distracting, and it can get to the point where maybe the assessor spends so much time looking at the criteria and the checklist and might miss critical things. And so Jackie shares some strategies on how she actually enables herself to be really present, to watch and learn from what's happening in the environment. And that's in the way she sets it up, in the way she communicates, sets the parameters, sets the boundaries, and then she'll be able to step back. And she uses a device. She just uses a mobile device, like her phone, to take notes, to take voice notes, and to really record very, very detailed observations, and will then go back afterwards and review the checklist. And that enables her to be able to pick up on all the nuances of the situation. Jackie also emphasises the importance of those notes, that, we shouldn't rely on our memory. And I know so many times I've thought to myself, not in assessment context, but in different contexts, I'll remember that, I'll remember all the details of that situation. And it doesn't take long before, 24 hours later, and I've forgotten so many of these really key points. And so as assessors in these situations, in the workplace, now we might only get one shot at this. We're really relying on people's, this one situation that we have one shot at, being able to observe all of these things happening. So we don't want to waste that opportunity and have to then come back and do it all again at a different time. Jackie supplements it with supplements her observations with third-party evidence, but also really reiterated that it shouldn't be relied on as a primary source of evidence. So looking back to the units of competency and seeing what they say, how many times a candidate has to do something to be competent, and making sure that's honoured as part of the observation. But also when it comes down to some of the consistency of performance, so when people are under, we all know when we're being assessed, we're on our best behaviour and we're following our processes really carefully. But Jackie also wants to look at what's the candidate like when she leaves the facility, and gathers some of that feedback from supervisors. And of course, under the principle of fairness, this needs to be communicated to the candidate. They need to know that, yes, as part of the overall assessment process, your supervisor will be providing feedback to the candidate. And another key point from Jackie, and you'll see this point is mentioned across all 4 of the assessors that we interviewed, is that great communication and feedback is paramount to building a good working relationship. And there's so many flow-on effects. And it was one of those points as I heard it popping up, my initial reaction is, of course, communication and feedback and organizational skills and those kinds of things are important. But seeing it come to life, really hearing some of the stories behind what happens if you don't communicate effectively and what are the benefits of that really clear communication, it really brought that topic to life. So I'm going to talk about communication a little bit more later on. This is Lynn from ETC, and I'll just point out that ETC were New South Wales large training provider of the year last year. So a really awesome training provider. And Lynn works in, Lynn's a chef and is also a trainer and assessor and works in that industry. So Lynn's, on this day when I got to meet with Lynn, we went and observed a candidate, Christy. She was, on this day, she was making a pastry, a short crust pastry, I think it was. And yeah, and we went into the kitchen. It was a real work environment, a real work day at an RSL club. And yeah, and these assessments are a part of a traineeship. So again, we've got real workers that are on the payroll, they're on the clock, they're on the job, they're working as part of their traineeship. So the assessment happens in a real functioning workplace, and all the learning happens in that setting as well. And some key takeaways from Lynn. So I think I had a real aha moment with Lynn, where I just realised deeply the importance of clear communication and the benefits of building rapport with not just the candidate, but the team supporting the candidate. And you can see, here we are in the photo, that's me and Lynn in the blue shirt, and then the team from the workplace. So in the chef's hat next to me is Christy, and she was the candidate who was being assessed. And we've got the head chef Mitchell there next to Christy, and Judy, who is the manager for the RSL club. And everyone there is really happy, and it was just immediately obvious when I walked into this workplace that Lynn had done an amazing job of building these really great relationships between the RTO and the employer. And I could see the benefits to the assessor, to Lynn, of having created this awesome rapport. It was almost like, if it wasn't for the uniform, you could have maybe seen Lynn as being another employee there, because, there was a bit of that sort of friendly banter and all those kinds of things, which is really good, because in the units that Lynn's assessing, I don't know if you've ever seen any of these commercial cookery units, but the list of things that need to be observed, of the different range of cooking equipment and techniques and strategies that need to be seen is so huge. And so it can't all be observed. It's just not feasible. So Lynn does need to rely very heavily on third-party reports from Mitchell, in this case, the supervisor. Lynn emphasised the importance of being highly organised and prepared. So Lynn spends a lot of time traveling, and especially being, you know, in our area, we're in a regional area, so it's very rare that you go somewhere that isn't a, you know, half an hour to an hour drive somewhere, you know, down the Pacific Highway. And so you've got to make sure that that trip is going to be worthwhile, and that you don't show up and, oh, whoops, you know, sorry, we didn't roster Christy on today. She's not here. She's not in today. You know, so that communication and organisation is very, very important to make the most of that visit. Again, clear expectations with the employer and the candidate were really important here. And also, I got to see, again, there were many of these moments where, you know, I see this a lot as part of my TAE work, but just seeing it come to life in a real situation, I got to see the importance of an assessor being an expert. You know, the fact that Lynn is also a highly experienced, qualified and highly trained chef, and you know, someone who works and knows that industry so intimately, means, number one, she can build that rapport very well, but also has an understanding. And, you know, she said, for example, the chef does not want to see me showing up with my clipboard and pen at lunchtime, you know, in the middle of a busy lunch rush, when we've got, you know, all the seats in the restaurant are filled and everyone's working hard, you know, like no one wants to know me at that time of day. And so that deep understanding of all the nuances of the industry enables someone to be able to, enables the assessor to be able to slot in and to work effectively, I think. So that was really awesome. And this one was really different. I love this as a sort of separate, because I think, you know, when I've thought of who can I speak to, who can I draw on from my network to present to you these case studies, you know, so my first thoughts were things like hospitality and aged care, because these are, you know, these are really big industry areas in Australia and areas that have high training needs. But this one was kind of came from a connection, sort of slightly left of field, but, you know, the Brush Farm Corrective Services Academy is a really unique RTO, and it's unique because in this particular situation anyway, the Certificate 4 in Correctional Practice, the only people who enrol in this course are the people who are working with New South Wales Corrective Services. So the RTO, or in this case, the course, is built entirely and specifically for the job that it serves. And so it was really awesome to see what a vet qualification can look like when it's being hyper contextualized for a specific job role. So the way they run their course is really robust and draws on a lot of different experiences for the candidates. So they have a split, they have 2 lots of 4 weeks at the academy, at Brush Farm Academy. And then in between those 4 weeks, they go and do a 4-week work placement on the job with Corrective Services New South Wales. And then they go on to do an overall 10-month work placement, but they have strategically placed assessments at 6 and 10 months throughout that work placement period. They have it very strictly set up with strict protocols and timeframes. So some key lessons from talking with this assessor was that I got, as I mentioned, I got to see the benefits of a highly contextualized and a tightly integrated course, you know, just to see what it's like when you can build one course for one job. Very interesting. They select and train expert workplace assessors. So of course they've got the academy and they've got the trainers and assessors that work there that kind of manage the overall course and the training and everything else. But then throughout the state, because remember they've got these offices all over the state of New South Wales, they select experts in their role who, you know, who demonstrate leadership in their jobs, and they train them up to be and qualify them in just being an assessor. So they will conduct those 6 and 10-month assessments that I mentioned, and they gather evidence as a kind of an assessment day on these strategic points. They emphasize the importance of involving team leaders and supervisors, because again, these are the people that get to watch their assessment candidates on a day in and day out basis. Again, this assessor really emphasized with me the importance of clearly establishing expectations and parameters. So they have a briefing with each candidate. So they assess one candidate over the period of, or it's actually 2 days. There's 2 separate assessment days. But before the assessment day, this assessor will call them, have a bit of a discussion with them, talk about what's going to happen, answer any questions. Again, just in the same as we learned from Steve in the road traffic control situation, this assessor really emphasised that importance of making sure that they know what's going to happen on the day, everything that's expected on them. And they supplement that with written instructions as well. Another thing that I learned from this assessor was that they do a very, very detailed report on their findings. So they have a few checklists. You know, the checklists were not especially detailed, but they kind of more rely on a detailed report. So they'll be kind of this was only explained to me. I didn't get to actually see it, but it was these kind of key points, and then the report would actually report on the observations and the findings of the candidate. And I think that's really good, because it means that there's no opportunity for tick and flick. You know, we all hear that terminology, tick and flick, which is really not a situation we want to have for assessors, because it means we end up in a situation where we're not really honouring the rigour that competency-based assessment needs. So that was really good to see such a detailed report. This assessor mentioned that often the reports are about 10 pages in length. They're really detailed. And they said to me, hey, look, it just doesn't cut it that these candidates for assessment have been putting in 10 months of really, really hard work. And then for me to turn around and just go, yeah, great job, you know, thumbs up, kind of, it just doesn't cut it. So the assessor really emphasised here the importance of very, very detailed and specific feedback. Certainly acknowledging the things that are done well, but also what takeaways, what things can the candidate take away to continually improve their practice from here on in. So that was really fascinating for me. So for me, you know, and I've been doing this for over 18 years now. And much of that time I've been involved in TAE. So I spend a lot of time looking at RTOs and looking at the way people assess and all that kind of thing. And I can assure you that what I saw in these 4 case studies are 4 really strong examples of excellent assessment, all 4 of them in their different ways, but also there were lots of common themes as well. So let's look at those common themes. I'm sorry, I'm not looking at the chat, but I've got the lovely Jasmine helping out there in the background as well. Sushir, thanks for your question. I don't know what this detailed report includes. I mean, you can look up the qualification, the certificate for and corrective practices. That will have a lot more information on probably what that report includes. Yes, slides will be available, absolutely. And everyone who participates in the live session gets a certificate as well, as a thank you for your time. So let's look at some of the common themes from these, from what I observed. So a lot of these points I've already mentioned, but I'll just go through them again because I want to underscore what really important lessons I learned from this experience. Number 1, the stakes are higher in a workplace assessment. So when you've got students in a classroom or, you know, at an institute of some kind, you can very carefully set up the assessment environment in whatever way that you want. You know, you can introduce role plays that have particular challenges, and you can really manage the situation really nicely. But that's not the case in workplace assessment. Workplace assessment is a very, very valuable and an excellent way to determine if someone's competent, because you can't get more real than a real workplace. You're essentially watching the candidate performing the skills in the way and in the setting that they'll be doing once they graduate. So it's the perfect environment to observe these skills, but the stakes are high. So you've got students who have the potential to, if they're not trained correctly or whatever, waste material. It might be food wastage, if it's a building site, wasting building materials, mixing concrete incorrectly, those kinds of things. Errors. So errors can be, I guess, at the lower end of the scale, just embarrassing for the organization, but at the higher end of the scale can have, safety and risk factors. Time. These people are typically on the payroll. They're an employee of the organization in most cases. So that's really, really important to think about when you go in there. How can I maximize my visit to the workplace and minimize my impact, minimize my, compromising the integrity of the assessment? So the key lessons in this sense were that workplace assessors need strong planning and organizational skills. I saw so many examples of where this could go wrong. If someone was not well organized and hadn't planned it very well, then the whole thing could really fall apart very, very quickly. I also, when I visited the RSL club, I got the opportunity to sit down and also speak with the manager of the organization. And I was able to ask her about, what's her perspective? What's it like for her as an employer to bring an RTO into the picture and to have them coming into the workplace and conducting these types of observations? And she reflected on her previous experiences with other providers where the planning and organizational skills were not there. It might have been that she mentioned that sometimes they just wouldn't hear from them. There'd be months and months and months and no one would show up, and then all of a sudden someone would show up and conduct an assessment, and it was kind of like out of the blue, and it made it very difficult for the organization to work around that. And I think as the assessor, even if I was the assessor and I had really poor organizational skills, just showing up out of the blue, I'm probably not going to be very popular on the day. Everyone's going to want me to get out of their hair, and I'm probably not going to be able to see the things that I want to see. I'm not going to be able to observe those behaviors and that performance that I really want to get to make a proper, robust assessment. And this flows into being professional and punctual. I mean, we're there to represent the training provider we work for. We need to have strong communication skills, again, emphasizing that. And I've got a slide on strong communication skills coming up. And rapport building skills. I very much saw the benefits of strong rapport being built in all of these situations, especially when it came time to being able to gather that third-party evidence from the employer, from the managers and the supervisors, or from being able to slot into the organization at a time and, when something's happening, maybe there's a specific event, and gather evidence of that. And when you've got good rapport with the organization, with the candidate, with the employer, it means everything happens really, really smoothly, and you become a welcome, almost like a member of the organization, which is great. So on the point of communication, so that, as I mentioned, it goes for the employer, the supervisor, the staff, and the candidate, not just the candidate. This is all about setting expectations, clarifying responsibilities, and sometimes resetting expectations, because often these relationships are not just a once-off thing, but in the case of these traineeships, they often go over 12 months, sometimes more. And in that period of time, maybe some of the expectations can have a bit of a drift. And so the assessor needs to come in and kind of reset those expectations and have a discussion about what that's like, and what's expected of them, and what they need to do, what deadlines, or what unit we're assessing, or what evidence I need to come and see you do. Good communication helps to ensure access to the different opportunities. So from your own practice, when you look at the units of competency that we have in VET, they often have a very detailed list of things that a candidate must be able to do. And so, for example, the correctional practices one was really, really interesting. The assessor told me that, you know, the candidate over that period of time when they're in the workplace, they need to have been exposed to dealing with different types of offenders, you know, very specific types of offences that they've committed. You know, writing different types of reports or working perhaps with offenders that have mental health issues. And so this communication and the relationship that they build up in that case means that they can communicate with the team leader and the manager that's looking after the candidate and say, hey, just checking to make sure that, you know, this person has had the opportunity to write a report about an offender in this situation. Or in the case of in commercial cookery, Judy, the manager of the RSL club, gave me an example of, hey, you know, we've got a function coming up tomorrow. We've got to make 600 sandwiches. 600 sandwiches. So are there any units in there that have, you know, sandwich making in them? Because we're going to have all hands on deck. Everyone who's doing these traineeships are going to be making sandwiches tomorrow. If you want to watch someone make a sandwich, that's when it's going to happen. And so having that flexibility as well to be able to get in on those opportunities will mean that the assessor can take advantage of and maximize the opportunities for observation. It's also about keeping a reference point of progress throughout the journey, especially on these longer journeys in, say, traineeships, is keeping the candidate anchored along the way and going, okay, you know, these are the units you've completed, but these are the ones we need to still do. I need to make sure I see you doing these things and those things. Prompts and reminders about upcoming visits so that they can avoid that situation of showing up and suddenly the person hasn't been rostered on that day, or they're not given the opportunity, or they don't have that job on that day where they perform that particular skill. They need to keep the employer informed of the candidate's progress. And as I've already mentioned, knowing about opportunities for assessment. So knowing about when those functions are coming up where they're going to be making 600 sandwiches, you know, these are really golden opportunities for the assessor to be able to observe those skills in action. Clear instructions. So I saw that in all the cases, the benefits of that, particularly in my discussions with Steve and Jackie, they very clearly doubled down on that, you know, the importance of it in terms of a safety perspective, but also in terms of fairness to the candidate. Remember, one of the principles of assessment is fairness, and it helps establish a robust and a strong environment for the assessment to happen. It's a reliable situation because all the candidates, they know what they're doing, they know what's expected of them, and the assessor can then follow through their process, knowing that the candidate's going to do that without any guidance and support. The assessment strategies that I saw were predominantly observation, as you can imagine. You know, most of this we've been talking about going in and seeing the candidate in action in a real environment. But they also supplemented this with questioning. And when I say questioning, I didn't see many written tests or anything like that, but it was more about that sort of interview style questioning, or maybe the assessor has observed them doing something. So in the case of Lynn assessing Christy making the short crust pastry on that day, you know, once the process had been finished, Lynn followed up with a few questions of, okay, you know, what might happen next, or what would you do if this happened, or what's this situation? Why did you select that technique, and those kinds of things. So it just helps the assessor add more context and commentary to what they've observed and helps to make the evidence stronger. As I've mentioned, third-party reports were relied on quite a lot. And, you know, sometimes third-party reports in assessment are misused and perhaps used in a kind of a spirit of laziness. I've seen it used in a lazy way. You know, how can I cover off as much of this unit of competency as possible without having to spend too much time with the candidate, and over-reliance on a third party. Now, remember, third parties are not qualified. Well, they might be, but in most cases, they're not qualified assessors. So the third party is not to be relied on to make assessment decisions for you, but they're an incredibly valuable source of information to provide that feedback on consistency of performance. And I've got on the right-hand side there, now, you're not meant to read that. I've kind of just put that like that for comedic effect. But this is just one unit in the commercial cookery Cert 3, just one unit, and it goes well off the page on each end. And so you can see in just this one unit, the types of things that the assessor would need to gather evidence of the candidate doing. You know, using different things like microwave and the oven. Some of these things I don't even know what they are. Scales, slicing machines, stovetop, chef knife, filleting knife, palette knife, utility knife. So there's a lot going on in just one unit, and often these qualifications have 15, 16, up to 20 units. There's a lot happening, so that your third parties are going to become really good friends to you as a workplace assessor when you can't observe every little thing in every unit of competency. And portfolio is also relied on to mainly in the corrective services one, because a large part of that Cert 4 included report writing and record keeping and those kinds of things as well. So they certainly observe the skills like interviewing and that sort of thing. But then when it comes down to the case management and that sort of thing, portfolio is a really strong way to gather the evidence. Some final tips and tactics that I guess I could boil down from what I've learnt from my time with these 4 amazing assessors. Observe, listen, and be present. So get to know yourself and your own way of working. But I think what I see is the importance of not missing anything in those real environments that are busy, noisy, high pressure, hot, slippery. There's lots of things going on. So you need to do whatever you can to be able to really see what's happening in your candidate, to properly observe that performance. And so for some of the assessors, this was not getting too bogged down in all of the finer details of the checklist, but more focusing on taking lots of notes, being very present, and then as soon as possible after the actual event, going back and then, writing up the notes, filling in the checklist and all those kinds of things. So don't rely on your memory. I know, at least for myself, I can't rely on mine any more than maybe a couple of hours after observing something. Use your industry expertise. So we hope, in most cases, that someone who is assessing in a workplace, in an industry, probably is also an industry expert. I think without that, it can become a serious problem. But when you do have that industry expertise, you can actually rely on your own experiences in industry to know how to coordinate and how to set up the environment for the assessment. When is the best time to get in there and conduct the assessment? Every assessor talked about the importance of useful feedback. We all love giving good feedback and telling candidates, what they've done well and how great they are. And I love that part, of course, but we need to also, in many cases, give feedback on unsuccessful performance. So working on your skills of being able to communicate when someone hasn't been able to meet the requirements of a unit. Building great relationships. I saw so many examples of where the great relationships were probably a key factor in the assessment process being a lot smoother and more effective than it would have been without it. And if it's safe and if it's relevant, I think this is all very contextual. There's lots of different industries here. Do consider modifying the situation if you need to enable observation of specific requirements. So the example that I saw in the road traffic control was introducing the runner, because you might observe 10 different road traffic control settings, and they don't see any runners, any people running through the red light or the stop sign. So they might need to introduce that so that they can see how people behave in that situation. I'd like to thank Steve, Kel, Ross, Kate, and the crew at Learning Live, Coffs Harbour and Port Macquarie, and all of the students that I observed in my visits. I'd like to thank Jackie, Karen, and John at NV College in Maxville, the candidate Leslie, and the beautiful residents at the Riverside Gardens in Nambucca. I'd like to thank Lynn, Peter and Catherine at ETC, Christy, Mitchell and Judy at Maxville RSL, and Brush Farm Corrective Services Academy for allowing me to gather this information for my own learning. I've learned so much, and to be able to share that as well. So as I mentioned, I'm making a video about this. I filmed a lot of different things. So I'm making sort of like a very mini documentary that I'll be able to share with you once it's all put together. So it's coming together really nicely. And I have an announcement too, that we've got another session just announced coming up. Just give me a moment, I'll put it in the chat. But the session is supporting students with disability in VET. And this is a special guest session. So I'm really trying to bring in some special guests to our community. So we've got Darlene McLennan, who's the manager of ADCET, so the Australian Disability Clearinghouse on Education and Training. And it's a focused session on what we can do as VET practitioners to support students with disabilities. So a very important session. And Darlene is an amazing wealth of information. So